This little book rack packs a lot of woodworking techniques into a small weekend project. But it all starts out pretty simply. I cut 2 rails and then join them with a solid wood shelf. Well, I went ahead and cut the 2 rails to length and to width. And then later on, in order to join the rails to the frame, we're going to use what's called a saddle joint. And that starts by cutting dados on both sides of the rails. Then much later on, when we make the frame, we're going to cut another joint, and this will just fit together just like that. So it starts by making these 2 dados, and that happens over at the table saw. I set up the dado blade and use the rip fence as a stop. Then I cut a very shallow dado on one side of the rail, flipped it over and cut a dado on the other side, and then did the same thing on the other end of the rail. Well, with the dados cut on the ends of the rails could actually work just like this, but I decided to add a little bit of a detail, and that is to cut a long cutout along the whole bottom side of the rail. And that starts by making a bevel cut on the end of the rail. I used a regular saw blade, set to 30 degrees, and made a bevel cut at both ends of both rails. Well, after making the bevel cuts, now it's time to go ahead and remove the waste section between these 2 cuts. And to do that, I'll start by just drawing a line between the 2 cuts. And then I'll go over to the bandsaw and remove most of the waste. This is just a rough cut, staying on the waste side of the line. Well, to smooth up the cut made from the bandsaw, I'm going to use a flush trim bit over at the router table. Now this means that I have to put on a straight edge, and I've made it out of hardboard, and I'm going to attach it with some double-sided tape so it's right along my cut line. The flush trim bit has a bearing that rides right along the edge to produce a smooth cut. Well, that flush trim bit removed most of the waste, but there's a tiny little nib here the bit couldn't get to, so I'm just going to use a very sharp chisel and pare that off by hand. So you can see there's a lot of woodworking involved in just making this cutout. Now there's a couple of more steps on the rails to finish them up. First, I want to miter the end of the rail to match the bevel on the inside of the cutout. And second, to attach the rails to the end frames and the shelf, I'll drill countersink holes. Well, now to complete the base, I have to make the solid wood shelf. So I have the 2 rails, and I cut the shelf to length to fit exactly between these dados at the end of the rails. And to mount it, I've cut grooves along the edge of the shelf, and that slips right over the rails. Now, before I actually assemble all of this, I want to go ahead and make the end frames. Well, the end frames on this book rack are classic frame and panel construction. And they start out like all frames. That is, we cut the vertical pieces, the stiles, to length and width, and then the horizontal pieces, the rails, to length and width. Now, the bottom rail is extra wide to allow for that same cutout that we had on the base rails. And then all of these pieces are joined with good old stub tenon and groove joinery. And that all starts by cutting a centered groove on all of the work pieces. Now to do that, I've mounted a rip blade in the table saw and adjusted the fence so it's just slightly off center of the thickness of the work pieces. Then I made 1 cut, flipped the piece around, and made a 2nd cut. Now with all the centered grooves cut, I can cut short stub tenons on the ends of the rails to match the groove. To do that, I've mounted a dado blade in the saw and adjusted the fence as a stop. I'll make 1 pass, flip the piece over, and make a 2nd pass. Well, the stub tenons complete all of the joinery we need to assemble the frame. But there's actually 2 more steps to do. First, we need to make this cutout on the bottom rail to match the cutout that we made on the base rails before. And second, we need to cut a notch on the bottom edge of the stiles of the frame. Now that notch completes this saddle joint that we talked about earlier. Just goes like this. Well, to cut that notch, I've mounted a dado blade in the saw, then attached a tall auxiliary fence to my miter gauge and clamped on a stop, which will hold the stile in place to make the cuts. I'll make one pass, then flip the piece around and make a second pass. Well, Brian, I've got this frame all assembled with the base. All we need is a panel inside.
Now for this book rack, we decided to go with this chip carved panel. Now that can seem a little intimidating, so there are some simpler options.
Well, in the plans, we show a few different options that are pretty simple. Just this one with square shoulders. We changed it up a little bit and made 4 separate panels over at the router table. And then we've got one with traditional coved edge. But I really like this chip carved one that you did.
You know, chip carving really isn't all that difficult. I mean, we're carving into softwood, this basswood here. So I've already got my panels ready, single chip carving knife. I've got my patterns at the bench, so I'm going to head there, get started.
Okay.
Now, carving is one of those things that can really dress up a project. But carving can be intimidating, and it's a skill that can take a while to learn. Now, the nice thing about this book rack is that carving on the end panels is a technique called chip carving. It doesn't require a lot of expensive tools, and you can master it fairly quickly. So you can get great results like this in short order. Now, chip carving is nothing more than removing a V-shaped chip from the surface of a workpiece. Now, what you do is you'll make an angled cut down one side, and then a second angled cut down the other side. And by repeating this in a pattern, you'll create an overall design, like the pine cones and pine needles here. Now, while you can freehand a design, I always find it best to lay out my pattern directly on my workpiece. Now, for this book rack, that workpiece starts out as a blank that's cut to size, and then I headed over to the router table and did a little rabbiting around all the edges on both sides of the panel to create this raised field, and that's where I'll attach my pattern. I'll just spray the backside with some spray adhesive. I'll attach the pattern, and then what I end up with is a workpiece like this that's ready to work with. Now, I like to use a paper pattern because I like these nice sharp lines that I can follow with the knife I'll be using, and that's a cutting knife like this. And of course, I want to make nice sharp cuts, so I usually keep a ceramic sharpening stone handy to hone the edge. Now, what I like about the blade is it angles inward from the handle, so it presents it at the workpiece at a comfortable angle when you're holding it. And finally, it's a very thin blade, but it's sturdy, so it'll slice through those fibers for a nice clean cut. Now, with my pattern attached, I already have my knife honed, so I'm ready to start making those first cuts. Let's get this out of the way here. Now, I'm going to start with this pine needle right here. Now, this is actually going to take 3 cuts. There's a short cut here right at the end that I'm going to have to make. Now, I want to make sure I present this at the right angle here so that I'm comfortable, so I'm just going to spin this a little bit here. Then, I'm going to make a plunge cut, just a shallow one, right here to define that end. Then, I like to make my outside cuts first. So, I'm just going to spin my pattern around again, and I'll make this cut. Now, I'm going to start fairly deep, but as I get near the end of the pine cone, I'm going to come up just to the tip. Then, spin it one more time and make that last cut. Start shallow, and then complete the cut to the end till the chip pops right out. Well, that's all there is to chip carving. Now, I was a little bit off on my lines here, but the goal really is nice, smooth cuts. So I'm just going to get this finished up because Don's going to be here pretty quick.
Hey, Brian, nice job on that chip carving. I've got to try that sometime. It's nice.
Yeah, you know, it turns out it gives you a nice, unique look. Doesn't take that long to learn.
Right. Well, I've got the rest of the base here, so we can actually start assembling this whole thing. The 2 rails, the solid wood shelf fits on top here.
Yeah.
There we go.
You know, once that's together, we can take that glued up frame and we'll just kind of drop in just like that. Get that out of there. And we also got this little cap piece that'll go on at the end.
Right. Now, once we're sure all this fits, then we can actually glue the frame together screw the base together, and we'll have a very nice little book rack.
Woodsmithplans.com. Hundreds of professional, high-quality woodworking plans right at your fingertips. Every single plan is presented as an easy-to-download digital package that includes pages of step-by-step instructions, full-color photos, illustrations, and exploded views, retail sources for hardware and supplies, plus a cutting diagram and materials list. Many plans offer handy video overviews and guides. Plus, we're proud to offer our plans in both standard and metric. Everything is here, from gorgeous heirloom furniture projects to handy shop projects and upgrades, clever, cost-effective storage solutions, as well as weekend projects and accessories that are great for gifts, all fully searchable and categorized for easy browsing. Woodsmithplans.com, everything you need for building fine woodworking projects.